Hey everyone, it's Nightharo here, and today we're talking about Dragonbane by Free League. So as it says on the cover, this is a classic tabletop role-playing game that is designed from the ground up to be easy to play, easy to GM, and easy to use. And I think they've hit it out of the park with that one. So I would say absolutely, first off, yes, I do recommend Dragonbane. I think it's a ton of fun. I have been playing several sessions where I've been GMing with several different groups, and we've had a blast so far. This is a low magic setting, and as they say, it is designed to work well as a long-form campaign, but to be perfect for shorter and one-off type campaigns. And I would absolutely agree. This is not necessarily a system that I would favor for a long-form campaign. I personally prefer a system with more crunch for a longer form campaign, but for a one-off, I could easily see this being my go-to or getting new people into role-playing games. I think Dragonbane does a great job here. And I can absolutely say that, yes, I certainly recommend it. Now, obviously, you need some details. So where does it fall as far as crunch or weight? I would call D&D 5e on an arbitrary scale of 1 to 10. I would say D&D 5e is like a 5 or a 6 for me. And depending on what kind of games you play, your scale might be skewed one way or the other. I've seen some interesting things out there. I play a lot of GURPS, so GURPS is definitely like a 9 or a 10 on that scale as far as difficulty. I would say Dragonbane is definitely like about a 4. I think it's to the south of the midway point, but it plays like a much lighter game. It plays like a 2. So it plays like one of those, role-playing focused, very rules-light type of systems, even though there actually is a decent amount of depth to the system. And that's why I think it's so great for new players, is there is something they can kind of work into and learn a little bit more about the game, the gamification of the combat and what have you, but it's great. It's super light if you need it to be. It is also an incredible value. Right now, the starter bundle is, I think, 40 USD. It's gone on sale recently, down from 50. Even at 50, it was a steal. I don't know if they're trying to move out some product, but it's still a crazy steal. And I highly recommend it for everybody. The base rulebook, if you're looking for the hardbound, something really nice that you can put on your shelf, I believe it's $40, which is, again, about typical for this sort of thing. But looking at the starter set, it has absolutely everything you need. There's standees. You can also get a digital version of this on your favorite virtual tabletop, whether that's Foundry or something like Alchemy. But Dragonbane is a truly unique system unto itself. There is a lot of that old school feel with a more modern rule set. Key features in the book that you'll find, I'll just kind of walk through them so you kind of have a vague idea. Or I'm going to make sure not to turn this review into a how-to. I've seen that happen in some other videos. So unique race or kin choices, as they're called in the book. Instead of classes, there is no real class, I would say, in Dragonbane. There are professions, which you could say, hey, this is very analogous to it because you pick this when you first start off, but there is no leveling up your profession. You level up skills, and then the level up process is actually mainly coming through leveling up skills individually, and then also heroic abilities or features, which are akin to feats in like D&D 5e. And again, I keep mentioning D&D because I know that's a touch point for quite a few people, so I'll probably continue to do that. Similarly with Pathfinder and what have you. I'm sure you guys can draw your own analogies. Unique leveling system, I would say that is pretty cool. It has a very flat leveling system, so you can actually have a situation, and I think this is really cool, where you have players that have been playing for a year, maybe 2 years, and then you could have someone new join the party, and they could join as a base level character and not have to like level up to join the rest of the party. So this is a really cool thing that kind of what D&D has gone with their Adventurers League. It's already built into Dragonbane, honestly. You could just show up, you have a character, and you're pretty much good to go. Do you have 1 or 2, heroic abilities? And that's pretty much it. Again, this is an old school feel, and what I mean by that, there's a handful of things. So one, age is a mechanic in this. You can choose to be a younger, middle-aged, or older. That can change during gameplay, whether by choice or because of an accident, and that actually affects your character. So it is, if you want to min-max, it makes sense to make an old wizened mage because your ability to cast spells will be greater, even though your physical abilities will be weaker. So if you want to min-max, that's actually one of the ways you can do it. And then a young fighter makes more sense as far as from a min-max perspective, but age is a mechanic. It is much easier to die than in a lot of modern systems. Now, some systems are very harsh and what have you. I would actually call Dragonbane gritty. I would say it's very light as far as how gritty it is, but if you're completely opposed to any sort of grit and any kind of like, a harsh reality, then I think Dragonbane might not be for you, but I think it's light enough that most people, even if you don't really like the gritty feel, are not really going to be turned off by it. To give you an anecdote about that, the first session, one of the first rolls that one of our players made, literally within a round or two, to, they crit failed on swinging their, I think it was a maul of some sort. They were rolling a d12, I believe, for damage. They maxed out damage and on themselves. They crit failed and they hit themselves and they almost knocked themselves unconscious, or they were in like mortal fear of dying and had to basically remove themselves for combat. That was one thing that I didn't like. You know, it's one thing shooting into melee and maybe hitting your friend. That can be funny. That makes for humorous interactions. But owning yourself when you're supposed to be this hero, it feels bad. So I don't actually love that part of it. But that is the kind of idea that you get from this. It's very easy to go down, to fall unconscious, or to die when compared to something like, again, like D&D 5e. Also, you know, there being a difference between dying and staying dead and you know, dying and being easily, you know, relatively easily resurrected. There are ingrained character weaknesses that come into play that you'll get to choose. There are attributes that actually matter, and it's not like everybody is at least decent at everything where you have kind of in modern D&D. It's very much the way they recommend you roll up your characters, which of course you don't have to follow. And they even make a point about that. Roll it however you'd like. One of our players, for example, chose the dexterity as their dump stat because they ended up really wanting a higher charisma than they were otherwise going to be able to. And they ended up having a move of 2, which was anywhere from half to a fourth of the movement of everybody else in the party. And this happened to be a mallard in this case, so they're a little waddling duck. It's kind of funny, but it really was a problem for that character and something I think they regretted, even though I discouraged them against it, and they probably wouldn't do again. So it's very easily to end up with a character that, you know, this makes for interesting role-playing opportunities, but it can feel bad as a player when you're actually, you know, the game part of the TTRPG. Now let's talk about the rules, because I think these are done quite well. The rules add considerable depth to the game, and you know, when I talk about rules and stuff like this, you can have fairly simple rules. So if you think of something like tic-tac-toe, and then you move up a step and maybe checkers, and then you go from checkers to chess. These all have fairly simple rules, getting a little bit more difficult, and maybe even quite a bit difficult when you consider chess from checkers. But after a while, you've played every game of checkers you're ever going to play, and same with tic-tac-toe. Chess, on the other hand, takes considerably longer, and it's not that it's that much more complicated. The rules are fairly straightforward. It's just they provide this level of strategy that you can layer on top of the rules that is incredibly deep. And that's what you have with Dragonbane. You have a lot of rules that are fairly simple, that are fairly straightforward. And at first they seem like, okay, cool, this is fairly straightforward. And then you realize, wait, there's actually a lot of strategy that you can layer on top of these rules to make something truly interesting. And I'll also add to that not only does Dragonbane allow for that level of strategy to be layered over these relatively simple rules, it also provides help with role playing. So this is an incredible system for helping out new players, because there are things in the system that encourage them to role play and remind older players like, hey, role play this. Because I think we could all use that nudge for, you know, every now and again to remind us like, hey, remember, you're tired, you're exhausted, you've been hiking all day. So there's actually ways in the rule system to remind players of that, and I think it's done really well. So let's go ahead and talk about some of those. One of them, the first up, is push rolls. Push rolls are where it's kind of like extra effort. So you can choose to take a status effect, depending on what particular ability is, to be able to re-roll a given skill. So let's say that you're trying to lift something heavy and you roll and you fail. You can choose to push that roll and be able to roll one more time. And what this effectively does is, in the case of strength, you become exhausted. So that is a status effect that you now have on you, and it's also encouraged to be a role-playing opportunity. Remember, your character is exhausted. Similarly, your character could be angry. This is the case with a mallard. That's actually one of their special abilities. For those who don't know, kin, one of the kins in the game is the mallard, which is a duck-like race. This is a throwback. Donald Duck is really big in Sweden, and so that's why you find duck-themed things throughout a lot of their various literature. It's just kind of a wink to that, Donald Duck being really big there, and when you think of Donald Duck, right, he gets mad sometimes, so you kind of get where the mallard ability came from. But you're allowed to push and get a chance to roll one more time for a particular ability. I really like this because it allows, you know, sometimes you're a given character and you really feel like you should be able to do this. You're a rogue that should be able to pick this lock. You're a scholar that should be able to solve this puzzle. You're the strong barbarian that should be able to lift this heavy object or this gate. And this allows you a better opportunity to not just be at the whim of the dice gods. So I think it works out really well. And the fact that it offers a role-playing opportunity is also really cool. There is also the memento rule. So you have some particular item that by looking at, you kind of gain a boon once per day. This could be reflavored very easily to where you're calling on, with your sword, you're calling on the power of Grayskull or whatever it happens to be, but you have some particular item. These are optional rules too, I should note. Initiative. The initiative system is done. You actually hand out cards, and at first, and even still, like the idea of handing out cards for initiative just feels wrong to me, and I don't like it on principle. In practice, I actually really like it and it works really well, especially at a physical game table. And being able to hand out the cards, and then if you need to swap initiatives, which you're allowed to do, you can just swap cards with somebody or with an NPC, and it works really well. And this is really where the layering of complexity and strategy comes in, because the NPCs are not really allowed to change their initiative, but you have one action per turn. You can move and then do some sort of action. And if you are attacked, you can choose to actively defend so as to take less damage. And again, you have to think about that in Dragonbane, taking damage is it's a lot scarier than a lot of other systems. Not as scary as some, but it is fairly scary. And so you don't want to do that. But if you choose to actively defend, that is your action for the round, and there's nothing else you can do. And so it turns this simple ordering of players and who goes first and who goes when into a situation where you might not want to go first because you want to see what the opponent does to see if you need to actively defend. And if they miss, then you're free to attack or do whatever you'd like without worrying about, taking a bunch of damage. But there is much more to it. Monsters always hit. They're considered to be always hitting, and they have special abilities that kind of just happen, typically to one particular player, but it could be an AoE effect or what have you. And so it adds a lot of layers of where, like, do I want to go now? There's their teamwork aspect. What are the other players doing, and what have you? And it makes for, even though the rules are fairly simple, just the simple ordering of players turns into an actual strategic part of the game, and I think it's done quite well. There is also a bit of inventory management, and then there's also rolling for exploration. These are both things that I was fairly skeptical of when I first saw them. I would say the inventory is done in a fairly simple way. I typically don't want to track anything. I don't care if my players track anything. It just seems far too tedious for me. The way it's done in Dragonbane is to somewhat provide a bit of realism, but it's done in a simple enough way that I don't mind it. It's simply items written down on a given line. This is done in a lot of other systems. I think it's done implemented quite well here with Dragonbane. With exploration, this actually gives your party a reason why it's great that you're a cook, or you might be a hunter, or you might have some other way, perhaps a crafter or a blacksmith or something like that, some other way where you could help the party with setting up camp, with pathfinding, determining which way to go, and it adds a lot to the role-playing. It kind of gamifies the role-playing portion of it to encourage players who are new or maybe not as comfortable to engage with role-playing with the rest of the party, and I think it's done really well. There are also ways of assisting other players, and this is done in a relatively unique way. So let's say there's some hard to pass terrain, right? There's perhaps a rock fall or something else. If you succeed and you've made it to the other side, or you're going to pass this particular check, you can then roll to help other people. So you have to succeed and then help the people that are less good at it. I think this is a great way. I mean, it seems so simple, but I think it's a really great way of handing assistance rolls, as opposed to let me help this person succeed even more who's already better at it. And I think it works quite well so that those who are good at a particular task can help those that are less good. And again, it provides that teamwork feel and helps the group feel more cohesive. There are other things with, abilities costing time, where you have to spend, a 6 to 8 hour shift doing something in particular to get the in-game benefit. And if there are some sort of timer on the game, then this can provide for some interesting play. There's a handful of others, but I won't go too much more in depth. There are also boons and banes. You might think of this as similar to advantage and disadvantage in D&D, but the problem with D&D is that there's so many sources of advantage and disadvantage that what they decided to do was to simplify it. And if you have advantage and disadvantage, no matter how many on each side, they just wash and you just roll flat. In Dragonbane, it's not that complex. There's not that many sources of advantage or disadvantage. They're fairly straightforward. So you actually net them. So if you have multiple things that would give you a boon on a particular roll, and then one thing that would give you a bane, campaign, you just simply take the net and roll extra dice equal to that. And each boon gives you an extra die, and each bane gives you an extra die, either reduces a die or gives you an extra die to roll to take the worst result. Now, to talk about grittiness, there are severe injuries in Dragonbane, so you can take an injury that will have a lasting effect. I think this adds really well to the, a bit of gritty, but also a bit of realism added to your campaign, and make it feel like, hey, this is dangerous and there are consequences, and it might be the best idea to avoid combat, which is one of the advice actually given in the rule book, and one that my player characters took on at least one occasion, deciding that, going down into that, deep dark cave seems like a bad idea. Why don't we just roll a stone over it and we'll just move on with our lives? And so I think that it actually works really well with some of this injury, that it can cause, lasting harm, not always permanent, but at least lasting for your character. And that adds to that gritty feel that I talked about earlier. There is also equipment breakage, which certainly adds to the gritty feel of it. The fact that you have to keep up with your equipment, the fact that it can be damaged and can be broken. There's also rallying at 0 hit points, where an ally can encourage you to keep going. But the problem is, if you keep taking damage even after you're at 0 hit points, that is a quick way to end up dead in Dragonbane. And Dragonbane is not something where it's going to be quickly and easy to resurrect you, so that could be quite a problem. You'd be rolling a new character in all probability. Heroic abilities, as I mentioned, have a very similar feel to feats. They are huge, they are significant in Dragonbane, and the main source of leveling up. They do not happen all the time. They're actually quite rare, only a couple of times in the course of a given campaign. Combat, I love how easy it is to GM combat in Dragonbane. I did find a few things kind of a little bit confusing and a little bit different at first, but it's just because it's new, not because it's difficult to understand. And the main source of that is that not every creature is a monster. So like a goblin isn't considered to be a monster. A monster is a type of creature, and it's most types of creatures, honestly. And those creatures, monsters, always hit. And they also have special abilities that you can just roll to determine what happens. So, one of the issues, I play a lot of GURPS, as I mentioned, and in GURPS, you really need to understand and know your bad guys if you're going to play them well. And what can happen is that you can be the end of a combat and realize that, I didn't play that character nearly as strong as it actually is, and it kind of made the combat not very fun for the players. You're not going to have that problem in Dragonbane. You don't need to know anything. I had a situation, as I mentioned, the party was like, yeah, we're not going in that cave, roll a stone over it and move on. And they're like, what's here on the map? And they headed to that area, and I had to come up with something, and I grabbed a couple of creatures and threw them in, and the party afterwards asked me, at least one of them asked me, if if that was planned, and if I knew about that and whatever, and it wasn't planned. I had no idea, and I didn't know anything about the monster. They did some pretty interesting things, because all I needed to do was roll a d6 to determine what it was going to do from its table, and it worked out incredibly well. And so from a GM's perspective, like 10 out of 10, it's pretty amazing. Other things here, the magic is definitely low magic, but magic is significant, providing healing and shielding in particular, and there are some pretty cool things you can do with it. Playing a full-on magic user, I could see there being a full magic book needing to come out in the future to add a little bit more depth to it. But the idea is that magic is fairly rare and not incredibly common, and so you do have that low magic feel to it. Even when you are playing a magic user, it might be useful, and it certainly will be useful for you to have a mundane way of attacking. You can't just rely on spells. You're not just throwing cantrips every round. It's not that magical of a world. We talked a bit about the journey system. There is pathfinding. There is making camp and finding food. You can also critically fail and have a mishap, and there's a mishaps table and the consequences for things like that. As well with the magic system, there are critical fails on the magic table that do some pretty interesting and pretty game-changing things if they are to happen. I'm sorry, I say critical fail. I should use the proper term, which is rolling a demon versus rolling a dragon. Dragon being a crit success, demon being a crit failure. And this is a d20 roll under system, so you're trying to roll lower. So a 1 is a critical success. Flat progression system, as we talked about, and then there's actually a section for GM guidance for making more campaigns. And as an experienced GM, I found it everything I would need. And I think it could be very useful for the average player. I think that that is maybe just getting into tabletop role-playing games to be able to make their own campaign. The system is simple and light enough that it really allows for that. So overall, I would rate Dragonbane as an 8 out of 10. I think this is a great system. I think it's incredibly well designed. As far as the rule design, I would actually say 10 out of 10. Even though though I don't necessarily agree with every single thing that's in here, even though I wouldn't do things that are different, most of that is style. It's very clearly easy and well written and easy to understand. As far as crunch, again, we talked about it. I would say it's probably about a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10, but it feels more like a 2. It feels very lightweight. From flavor, this is a blend of old school with new school type rules. There is a bit of grittiness to it, not overly so in my opinion, very light on the grit, but I would call it technically gritty. For rules assistance with RP, incredibly well done. It's not a ton. It's not like a role-playing heavy system where everything is designed around role-playing, but I will say that there are nods to it and encouragements, especially useful for new players who want to play a combat simulator game, but want a little bit of role-playing added in and can kind of learn as they go. The unique races and old school feel, I think, are really interesting. There are some really interesting level design mechanics here where how you level up is very slow. It's one skill at a time, typically based on a skill you used in that particular game session, and then you get rewarded for good role playing and for participating and not just beating things over the head. And it's different than the binary approach that the D&D takes, for example, where it's either kill monsters, get XP, or like, oh no, you need to complete a quest or something to get XP. There's more than 2 options, and I think Dragonbane illustrates that quite well. I would say this is incredibly high value for what you get, even if you're buying it on your virtual tabletop. Virtual tabletop, it's usually in the 30s is what I was finding. For the complete starter set, it's about $40 as I mentioned, at least USD. And there's incredibly nice artwork in this book as well, which is also nice to have. And Dragonbane, I really probably should have led with this, but Free League seems to take really good care of its people. And they seem to be a company that is concerned with more than just profit. And I think that is pretty huge. Now, with all of that, there are some cons and some things that perhaps, I have some feedback on. I think that the way the book is laid out, and also the way some of the stat blocks and other information is laid out, isn't the best. Even though the rules are designed really well, I find that some of the stat blocks are incomplete. There's not enough reprinting of information, so you have to go check other locations, and a lot of the pages are mostly blank. They're like left for the artwork and what have you, or an entire page is devoted to a profession, I guess, to, hey, here's the whole profession on one page, but it's mostly blank because the professions are actually pretty simple. So I find myself flipping through a lot of books and trying to find, or a lot of pages and trying to find a particular thing, and it being a bit difficult. And then I find things not reprinted enough for ease of use. There's also a situation in the middle of the book where it kind of gives you, like at the end of the character creation, it kind of tells you what it's going to tell you in the future. I just found that whole section confusing. So I think it really could benefit from a layout change and also some additional information and some additional information being reprinted so that it was very easy to find as a reference book, which is how many, rule books are used as a reference book. I think that the rules, as far as like damaging yourself, I find some of them interesting, where being able to damage your fellow players, but I would typically change that where you can't damage yourself most of the time, except for the case of spells or something perhaps, and instead come up with some other ways, harsh consequences of dealing with that, rather than just like doing a bunch of damage to yourself, because it just feels bad. It's usually not that fun. The harshness of the old school vibe, they mentioned that it would be good for long campaigns, but perfect for shorter ones. I would agree with that. I would tend to go with a different system that wasn't quite as gritty. You could play very carefully, but I could easily see your character being disposable or dying along the way if you weren't super careful in a long form campaign. And there are a handful of other things that kind of lend me to thinking that. But overall, I think that Dragonbane is an awesome system, and I am interested personally in doing some reviews and doing some guides on it on this channel. So keep an eye out, and maybe we'll have a couple videos out soon. Anyways, thanks everybody for watching. Hope you enjoyed Dragonbane, and we'll catch you in the next one.